The stage robber's bullet missed Clara Montgomery by 3 inches, shattering the window of the general store where she stood reading, and everyone in Sweetwater, Texas blamed her books for nearly getting her killed. It was April of 1878, and the small frontier town nestled in the dusty plains had little patience for a 22-year-old woman who kept her nose buried in pages instead of helping her widowed father run his struggling dry goods shop. Clara's mother had died bringing her into this world, and her father had raised her surrounded by the only treasure his late wife had left behind, a collection of 47 precious books that had traveled west in their covered wagon. The townspeople whispered that Clara's reading habit was unnatural, unseemly, and downright dangerous. Mrs. Thornton, the banker's wife, declared at the church social that no decent man would marry a woman who wasted daylight hours with novels when she should be learning to cook and sew properly. The younger women giggled behind their hands when Clara walked past with ink-stained fingers and faraway eyes. Even the children had taken to calling her book girl in mocking tones that made her cheeks burn with shame. Clara's father, Thomas Montgomery, had grown increasingly worried. His daughter was intelligent and kind, with long chestnut hair that caught the sunlight and warm hazel eyes that sparkled when she discussed her beloved stories. But her devotion to reading had isolated her from the community, and Thomas feared she would end up alone. He had gently suggested she put away the books during daylight hours, at least when customers might visit the shop, but Clara found the suggestion physically painful, like being asked to stop breathing. The day everything changed began like any other suffocating morning in Sweetwater. Clara had finished her chores before dawn and settled into the rocking chair by the shop window with a worn copy of Jane Eyre. The morning sun streamed through the glass, illuminating the pages as she lost herself in the world of Thornfield Hall. She was so absorbed that she barely noticed when the shop door opened, the small bell above it chiming softly. "Excuse me, miss." The voice was deep and hesitant, roughened by wind and sun. Clara looked up, startled, and found herself staring at the tallest man she had ever seen. He stood at least 6 feet 4 inches, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. His face was weathered and tanned, with strong features softened by uncertainty. Dust covered his worn denim pants and faded blue shirt, and his brown boots were scuffed from hard use. A black hat dangled from his calloused hands, revealing dark hair that needed cutting. But what caught Clara's attention were his eyes, a striking gray blue that reminded her of storm clouds on the horizon, filled with an intelligence that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Can I help you?" Clara asked, setting her book aside reluctantly. The man shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "I'm looking for Thomas Montgomery. I heard he might have work available." "That's my father. He's at the bank right now, but he should return within the hour." Clara studied the stranger with curiosity. "Are you new to Sweetwater?" "Just arrived yesterday. Name's Jacob River." He twisted his hat in his hands. "I've been working cattle drives up from San Antonio, but I'm looking to settle somewhere for a spell. Getting tired of the trail." Something in his voice spoke of bone-deep weariness, the kind that came from years of hard living. Clara estimated he was perhaps 26 or 27, though the sun had etched lines around his eyes that made him seem older. She noticed he kept glancing at the book in her lap, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome to wait here if you like," Clara offered. "Would you care for some water? It's already getting warm out there." "Much obliged, miss." Jacob stepped inside, and Clara noticed he moved with surprising grace for such a large man. She fetched a cup of water from the barrel they kept in the back room, and when she returned she found him standing very still, staring at the small bookshelf her father had built for her near the counter. His expression was one of such longing that it made Clara's breath catch. "Do you enjoy reading?" she asked, handing him the water. Jacob flinched as if she had caught him stealing. "I don't know my letters, miss. Never had the schooling." He drank the water in 3 long gulps, then added quietly, "But I always wondered what it would be like. To read, I mean. To have all those stories and knowledge just waiting there for you." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she could not quite name. Here was a man who looked at her books with reverence instead of scorn, who admitted his lack of education without shame, only regret. Before she could respond, the shop door burst open and 3 women entered: Mrs. Thornton, her daughter Evelyn, and Mrs. Parker, the seamstress. "Oh, Clara, still wasting time with your ridiculous books, I see," Mrs. Thornton announced loudly, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Don't you have actual work to do?" "I've completed all my morning tasks," Clara replied evenly, though her hands tightened on her skirt. "Reading isn't a task, it's an indulgence," Evelyn chimed in, tossing her blonde curls. "No wonder you can't catch a husband. What man wants a wife who ignores him for pages of nonsense?" Clara felt her face flame red, humiliation washing over her. She had endured years of such comments, but having Jacob witness it made the shame cut deeper. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but found no words would come. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Jacob said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the women's laughter. He stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Clara and the others. "But I've been all over Texas these past 8 years, and I've seen plenty of things worth praising. A woman who values learning and stories? That strikes me as something rare and precious, not something to mock." Mrs. Thornton's eyes widened with indignation. "And who are you to speak on matters of propriety?" "Just a cowboy, ma'am. But even a cowboy knows there's different kinds of strength. Takes courage to be yourself when folks tear you down for it." Jacob's voice was respectful but firm. "Seems to me Miss Montgomery here has plenty of that courage." The women huffed and muttered, making their purchases quickly before sweeping out of the shop in a cloud of perfume and indignation. When they were gone, Clara found herself trembling, overwhelmed by the unexpected defense. No one had ever stood up for her love of books before. No one had ever suggested it was something admirable rather than shameful. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." Jacob shrugged, looking embarrassed. "Just spoke the truth as I see it." He hesitated, then added, "My mother loved stories. She couldn't read either, but she knew dozens of tales by heart passed down from her grandmother. She used to say that stories were how we made sense of the world, how we understood what it meant to be human. She died when I was 12, and I never got to learn those stories proper. Always regretted that." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at this rough cowboy who spoke of his mother with such tender reverence, who defended books without being able to read them, and made a decision that would change both their lives. "Mr. River, if my father does hire you, and if you're truly staying in Sweetwater for a while, I could teach you. To read, I mean, if you wanted to learn." Jacob's head snapped up, his storm cloud eyes wide with shock. "You'd do that? Teach a grown man his letters like some child?" "Learning has no age limit," Clara said firmly, "and you'd be surprised how quickly adults can learn when they're motivated. It would take time and practice, but it's entirely possible." "I don't have money to pay for lessons," Jacob admitted, his jaw tight with frustration. "I don't want money. I want—" Clara paused, gathering her courage. "I want someone to share stories with. Someone who understands why they matter. That would be payment enough." Before Jacob could respond, Thomas Montgomery entered the shop, his graying hair windswept, and his weathered face creased with worry lines. He stopped short when he saw the tall stranger standing near his daughter, his hand automatically moving toward the pistol he kept behind the counter. "It's all right, Papa," Clara said quickly. "This is Mr. Jacob River. He's looking for work." Thomas relaxed slightly but kept his eyes on Jacob with a father's protective wariness. "What kind of work are you after?" "Whatever honest work you have, sir. I'm good with my hands, strong, and I learn quick. I've done cattle driving, ranch work, some blacksmithing and carpentry. I'm looking to stay in one place for a spell, maybe make something of myself beyond just drifting." Thomas studied Jacob for a long moment, taking in the calloused hands, the direct gaze, and the respectful posture. "I need someone to help with deliveries and heavy lifting around the shop. My back isn't what it used to be, and we've been falling behind on orders. The pay isn't much, but I can offer room and board in the loft above the stables out back. It's not fancy, but it's clean and dry." "That sounds fine. Sir, I'm much obliged. You can start tomorrow at dawn. We'll do a trial period of 2 weeks and see how it works out. Thomas extended his hand, and Jacob shook it firmly. As Jacob left the shop, he glanced back at Clara one more time. Thank you, Miss Montgomery, for the offer of lessons. I'll think on it. Please do, Clara said softly, watching him walk away with that easy, ground-covering stride. That evening, as Clara helped her father close up the shop, Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. That was a kind thing you offered that young man? Teaching him to read? You heard that? Clara asked, surprised. I came in through the back and caught the tail end of your conversation. Thomas studied his daughter with concern. Clara, I want you to be careful. He seems like a decent fellow, but we don't know anything about him. I know, Papa. But did you see how he looked at the books? Like they were treasures beyond price. How often do I meet someone who understands that? Clara's voice was wistful. Thomas sighed, pulling his daughter into a gentle embrace. Just promise me you'll be sensible, and that you'll keep the lessons here in the shop where I can keep an eye on things. I promise. Jacob showed up before dawn the next morning, earlier even than Thomas had requested. He worked with tireless efficiency, moving heavy crates and barrels that Thomas would have struggled with, organizing the storeroom, and making deliveries around town with a polite demeanor that impressed even the most suspicious townspeople. He was quiet, but not sullen, speaking when spoken to, but never wasting words. By the end of the first day, Thomas had to admit the cowboy was one of the best workers he had ever hired. It was 3 days before Jacob approached Clara about the reading lessons. She was sorting through a shipment of fabric bolts when he appeared beside her, his hat in his hands again, looking nervous. Miss Montgomery, I've been thinking about your offer. If it still stands, I'd like to learn to read. I'd be grateful for the chance. Clara's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Of course it still stands. We could start this evening after supper if you like. The shop will be quiet then. I don't want to impose on your time. You're not imposing. I want to do this. Clara met his eyes directly. Teaching you will be a joy, not a burden. That evening, after Thomas had retired to their living quarters above the shop, Clara set up a workspace at the main counter. She had gathered some basic materials. A slate and chalk she had used as a child, several simple primers, and a few of her most beloved books for when Jacob advanced. When he arrived, his hair was still damp from washing, and he had changed into a clean shirt. He looked terrified. Relax, Clara said gently, gesturing for him to sit on the stool beside her. We'll start simple. Learning to read is just learning to recognize patterns and connect sounds to symbols. You already speak English perfectly well, so you have all the sounds. We just need to show you how they're written. She started with the alphabet, printing each letter carefully on the slate and saying its name and sound. Jacob watched with fierce concentration, his gray-blue eyes tracking every movement of the chalk. When she handed him the chalk to try copying the letters, his large hands moved with surprising delicacy, forming careful, shaky characters. You have good control, Clara observed. Your letters are well proportioned for a first attempt. Used to whittle some, Jacob admitted. Never anything fancy, just small figures for trail bosses' kids. Helps to have steady hands. They worked for nearly 2 hours, and Clara was impressed by Jacob's focus. He never complained, never grew frustrated, and asked thoughtful questions about why certain letters made different sounds in different words. When she finally declared they should stop for the night, he looked almost disappointed. Same time tomorrow? He asked hopefully. Same time tomorrow, Clara confirmed, smiling. As the days stretched into weeks, a comfortable routine developed. Jacob worked hard during the day, proving himself so valuable that Thomas made his position permanent and even increased his wages slightly. In the evenings after supper, Clara and Jacob would meet in the shop for reading lessons. He progressed with remarkable speed, moving from individual letters to simple words within the first week, and by the second week, he was reading basic sentences. But more than the lessons themselves, Clara treasured the conversations that sprang up around them. Jacob would ask about the stories in her books, and Clara would tell him the plots, watching his face light up with interest. He in turn shared stories from his years on the trail. Narrow escapes from stampedes, beautiful sunsets over endless plains, and the complicated politics of cowboy crews. He spoke of sleeping under stars so thick they looked like spilled milk, of rivers that needed crossing and cattle that needed coaxing. "Why did you decide to stop drifting?" Clara asked one evening in mid-May. They had been working together for almost a month, and Jacob could now read simple paragraphs with only occasional help. Jacob was silent for a long moment, his finger holding his place in the primer. "I turned 27 last month. Been on my own since I was 14 when my father died. Spent all those years just moving, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Started feeling like I was disappearing, like if I died tomorrow there would be nothing to show I'd ever existed. No home, no family, no mark on the world." He looked up at her, his expression vulnerable. "That's a lonely feeling, Miss Montgomery. Real lonely." "Call me Clara, please. We've been working together for weeks now." "Clara," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her heart skip. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do the folks in this town treat you so poorly? You're kind and smart and patient. You work hard in this shop. What have you done to deserve their mockery?" Clara felt her throat tighten. "I'm different. I love books more than quilting bees and gossip. I prefer spending Saturday afternoons reading to attending social events. My father says I've isolated myself, and he's probably right, but I can't seem to help it. Stories feel more real to me than most of the people in Sweetwater. Is that terrible?" "No," Jacob said firmly. "That's not terrible at all. But it does seem lonely, like my drifting. Just a different kind." The observation struck Clara deeply because it was true. She had been lonely for years, surrounded by people who did not understand her, preferring the company of fictional characters to real human beings who disappointed and judged her. But sitting here with Jacob, teaching him to unlock the worlds contained in books, she felt less lonely than she had in years. "I suppose we're both looking for connection," Clara said softly. "You want roots, and I want understanding. Maybe we're not so different after all." "Maybe not," Jacob agreed, and when their eyes met, something electric passed between them, a recognition that went beyond words. The turning point came in early June, on a blazing hot afternoon when the whole town seemed to slow under the oppressive heat. Jacob had just returned from making deliveries, his shirt soaked with sweat, when a group of young men loitering outside the saloon decided to cause trouble. Clara was sweeping the front step when she heard their loud voices. "Hey, book girl, still wasting your time with those stupid stories?" one of them called out. It was Danny Fletcher, a ranch hand known for drinking too much and causing problems. Clara ignored him, continuing to sweep, but her hands tightened on the broom handle. "I'm talking to you!" Danny staggered closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. "Think you're too good for regular folks? Think you're smarter than us?" "I don't think anything of the sort," Clara said evenly. "Please leave me alone, Danny." "What if I don't want to?" Danny reached out and knocked the broom from her hands. "What if I want to teach you some manners?" Before Clara could react, Jacob was there, moving faster than she had ever seen him move. He stepped between Clara and Danny, his face calm but his body coiled with barely restrained power. "The lady asked you to leave her alone," Jacob said quietly. "I suggest you listen." Danny laughed, but it sounded nervous. "Who are you to tell me what to do, drifter?" "I'm someone who doesn't like seeing women harassed. Now move along before this gets unpleasant." Danny's friends had gathered now, 3 of them, all drunk and looking for excitement. 4 against 1, Danny sneered. "You sure you want to do this?" "I'm not looking for a fight," Jacob said, his voice still calm, "but I won't stand by and watch you bother Clara either. Your choice." For a tense moment, Clara thought violence was inevitable, but something in Jacob's stillness, in the absolute certainty of his stance, made Danny hesitate. The young man looked into Jacob's storm cloud eyes and apparently saw something that made him reconsider. He spat in the dirt and backed away, muttering curses, his friends following. When they were gone, Jacob turned to Clara, his expression anxious. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine, thanks to you." Clara was trembling, but not from fear. She was overwhelmed by the realization that this man who barely knew her had been willing to fight 4 men to protect her. "You keep defending me. Why?" Jacob looked startled by the question. "Because you're worth defending. Because what they do to you, the way they mock you for loving books and learning, it's not right. And because—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Because when I'm with you, teaching me to read, sharing your stories, I feel like I'm becoming someone better, someone with a future. You've given me a gift, Clara. The least I can do is stand up for you." Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough and calloused against her softer skin, but his touch was gentle. "Thank you, Jacob, for everything." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, and Clara felt something shift between them, a door opening to possibilities she had not dared to imagine. That evening's reading lesson was different. There was a new awareness between them, a heightened consciousness of every accidental touch, every shared glance. Jacob had advanced to the point where Clara had given him a simple novel, a Western adventure story she thought he might enjoy. He was reading aloud slowly but steadily when he came to a passage where the hero declared his feelings for the school teacher he had fallen in love with. Jacob's voice grew softer as he read the words, and when he finished the passage, he looked up at Clara with an expression that made her breath catch. "Is this how it happens in real life? Do people just know when they found someone special?" "I don't know," Clara whispered. "I've never experienced it myself, only read about it." "Neither have I," Jacob admitted. "Been too busy drifting to ever let myself care about anyone. But lately I've been thinking." He trailed off, seeming to lose his courage. "Thinking what?" Clara prompted gently. "Thinking that maybe I stopped drifting for a reason. That maybe I was supposed to end up in Sweetwater in this shop meeting you." Jacob set the book aside carefully. "Clara, I know I'm just a cowboy without much education or prospects. I know you could probably do better than someone like me, but I have to tell you that these past weeks learning to read with you, talking with you, they've been the best of my life. You make me want to be more than I am." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it. "Jacob, you don't understand. You already are more than you think. You're kind and hardworking and brave. You see value in things that matter, stories, learning, knowledge. You defend people who are weaker than you. You're exactly the kind of man I've dreamed about but never thought I'd actually meet." "You dreamed about me?" Jacob asked, his voice full of wonder. "Not you specifically, but someone like you. Someone who understood why books matter. Someone who saw me as something other than the strange girl who reads too much." Clara felt her cheeks flush. "I never thought such a person existed in Sweetwater." "He didn't," Jacob said with a small smile. "He had to drift in from San Antonio." Clara laughed, and the sound broke the tension between them. Jacob reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his large, gentle hand. "Can I court you properly, Clara Montgomery? Can I take you to church socials and town events and show everyone in Sweetwater that you're not alone anymore? That you have someone who values you exactly as you are?" "Yes," Clara breathed. "Yes to all of that." Jacob's smile was like sunrise, bright and full of promise. He did not kiss her, not yet, but the way he looked at her felt like a kiss, like a promise of all the kisses to come. The next few months transformed both their lives in ways neither had anticipated. Jacob courted Clara with old-fashioned determination, escorting her to church every Sunday, bringing her wildflowers he picked on his delivery routes, and reading to her from the books she loved as his skills improved. The town watched with mixed reactions. Some, like Mrs. Thornton, were scandalized that the book girl had caught herself a man, and such a handsome, capable man at that. Others were grudgingly impressed by Jacob's devotion and began to see Clara in a different light. Thomas Montgomery watched the courtship with a father's careful eye, but he could not deny that Jacob made his daughter happy in a way he had never seen before. Clara laughed more, smiled more, and seemed to glow from within. And Jacob, for his part, was clearly besotted. He looked at Clara like she hung the moon and stars, like every word from her mouth was precious. By late summer, Jacob could read well enough to work his way through most of Clara's books, though he still preferred when they read together, taking turns with passages, discussing characters and themes. He had a natural insight into stories, seeing layers of meaning that sometimes surprised even Clara. His favorite discovery was poetry, which moved him in ways he struggled to articulate. It's like they take feelings I've had but never could name and put them into words that make sense, he explained one evening in August. They were sitting on the porch behind the shop, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, like this one. He opened a book of Walt Whitman's poetry and read carefully. I am large, I contain multitudes. That's how I feel when I read now. Like I'm bigger than I was before, like I contain more. You do contain more, Clara said softly. Knowledge and stories expand us, make us capable of understanding things beyond our own experience. That's the magic of reading. Jacob set the book aside and took her hand, intertwining their fingers. I want to ask your father for permission to marry you. Clara's heart stopped. Jacob. I know it's soon. Only been 4 months since we met. But I'm 27 years old, Clara. I've spent enough years drifting to know what I want when I find it. And I want you. I want to build a life here in Sweetwater, to give you the home and family you deserve, to spend every evening reading with you and talking about stories and watching the sunset. I love you. I probably loved you since the day I walked into this shop and saw you reading by the window, looking like an angel touched by sunlight. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. I love you too. I think I loved you from the moment you defended my books to those awful women, when you said loving stories was something rare and precious. No one had ever said anything like that to me before. Is that a yes? If your father agrees, will you marry me? Yes, Clara said, laughing through her tears. Yes, absolutely yes. Jacob pulled her close and kissed her for the first time. A gentle, reverent kiss that tasted of promises and hope. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and smiling, the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Thomas gave his blessing with barely concealed joy. He had worried for years that Clara would never find someone who appreciated her unique spirit, and seeing her so happy eased a burden he had carried since his wife's death. The wedding was planned for October, when the brutal Texas heat would finally break and the weather would be pleasant. The preparations brought unexpected changes to Clara's relationship with the town. When word spread that she was marrying Jacob River, several women who had previously mocked her began to soften, perhaps recognizing that she was not so strange after all if such a fine man loved her. Mrs. Parker, the seamstress, offered to make Clara's wedding dress at a reduced price. Even Mrs. Thornton managed a stiff congratulations, though her daughter Evelyn remained pointedly cold. But not everyone was pleased by the engagement. Danny Fletcher, still nursing wounded pride from his confrontation with Jacob, began spreading rumors that the cowboy was no good, that he was probably running from the law, that he would break Clara's heart and disappear one day. Most people dismissed Danny's talk as the bitter mutterings of a drunk, but some uncertainty crept into the edges of the community's acceptance. The rumors reached a crisis point in late September, 2 weeks before the wedding. A U.S. Marshal rode into Sweetwater asking questions about a Jacob River wanted for killing a man in New Mexico 3 years prior. The news spread through town like wildfire, and by evening a small crowd had gathered outside the shop demanding answers. Clara felt her world tilting as she watched Jacob face the marshal in the dusty street. Thomas stood beside her, his face grim, one hand on her shoulder in support. "Are you Jacob River?" the marshal asked, his hand resting on his pistol. "I am," Jacob said calmly. "But I've never been to New Mexico, and I've never killed anyone." "You match the description. Tall, dark-haired, gray-blue eyes, about 27 years old. The Jacob River I'm looking for shot a man named William Karn in a dispute over cattle. I've heard of Karn, but I never met him. Marshal, I can account for my whereabouts 3 years ago. I was working a drive from San Antonio to Kansas, part of a crew of 15 men. The trail boss was Michael Sullivan, and he keeps detailed records. I was nowhere near New Mexico. The marshal studied Jacob carefully. You have proof of this? Sullivan's ranch is 2 days' ride from here. He can verify everything I've said. He'll remember me because I was the one who saved half the herd when we had a stampede near the Red River. I have scars on my leg from where a steer gored me during that mess. Clara found herself holding her breath, her hand clutched in Thomas's. The crowd murmured, some skeptical, others seemingly convinced by Jacob's steady, truthful tone. I'll ride out tomorrow and check your story, the marshal said finally. Until then, you stay in town. Don't make me regret not putting you in irons. I'll be here, Jacob promised. I have a wedding to attend in 2 weeks. I'm not going anywhere. The marshal nodded and walked away to arrange accommodation for the night. The crowd dispersed slowly, full of speculation and gossip. When they were finally alone, Clara ran to Jacob, throwing her arms around him. I was so frightened, she whispered against his chest. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Jacob held her tightly. But Clara, you have to know I'm telling the truth. I've never killed anyone. I've worked hard and lived honest. Whatever trouble this Jacob River in New Mexico caused, it wasn't me. I believe you, Clara said fiercely. I know who you are, Jacob. I've spent months watching you, learning with you, falling in love with you. You're not a killer. Thomas approached cautiously. Son, is there anything else we should know? Anything from your past that might come back to haunt us? Jacob shook his head. No, sir, I've done nothing I'm ashamed of. I left home at 14 because my father drank himself to death and there was nothing left for me there. I've worked cattle drives and ranches, moved around a lot, but I've always been honest and law-abiding. This is just a case of mistaken identity. When the marshal talks to Sullivan, it'll all be cleared up. The next 2 days were agonizing. Clara tried to maintain her normal routine, but she found herself unable to concentrate on anything, even her beloved books. Jacob continued working, his calm demeanor never cracking, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the worry in his eyes. The marshal returned on the morning of the third day, riding into town with Michael Sullivan beside him. Clara's heart leaped when she saw them, and she rushed out of the shop to meet them. Sullivan was a grizzled man in his 50s, weathered by years under the Texas sun. He dismounted and immediately spotted Jacob. River, good to see you, boy. Marshall here tells me some fool thinks you killed a man in New Mexico. That's the accusation, Jacob said quietly. Well, it's horse shit, if you'll pardon my language, miss, Sullivan said, nodding apologetically to Clara. Jacob was working my drive 3 years ago, just like he said. I've got the records in my saddlebag. More than that, I've got 15 other men who'll swear to it. Jacob's one of the best hands I've ever employed, honest as the day is long. Saved my herd during that stampede near the Red River. I've been hoping he'd come back to work for me, actually. The marshal pulled out a folded paper and studied it, then looked at Jacob again. Sullivan's records show you were in Kansas during the time of the killing. And looking at you closer now in better light, you've got a scar on your chin that the wanted man doesn't have. I apologize for the trouble, Mr. River. You're free to go about your business. Relief flooded through Clara so intensely she felt dizzy. Jacob thanked both men, shaking their hands, and Sullivan spent a few minutes trying to convince him to come back for the winter drive. Jacob politely declined, explaining that he was settling down and getting married. Well, good for you, son, Sullivan said, grinning at Clara. She's a pretty one. You treat her right. Every day of my life, Jacob promised. When they were alone again, Clara and Jacob simply held each other, letting the fear and tension drain away. I'm sorry you had to go through that, Jacob said softly. I know it must have been terrible, wondering if there was something about me you didn't know. I never doubted you, Clara insisted, not for one moment. I know your heart, Jacob River. You're good and true, and I would have believed in you even if the marshal had dragged you away. I don't deserve you, Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, you do. We deserve each other. Two lonely people who found each other against all odds. That's not luck, Jacob. That's fate. The wedding took place on a perfect October afternoon. with the sky a brilliant blue and a cool breeze tempering the Texas heat. Clara wore a simple but beautiful white dress, her chestnut hair pinned up with wildflowers Jacob had picked that morning. Jacob wore new clothes purchased specially for the occasion, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his face shining with joy. The ceremony was held in the small church, with most of Sweetwater in attendance. Thomas walked Clara down the aisle, his eyes wet with tears, and placed her hand in Jacob's with a whispered blessing. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about two becoming one, and Clara barely heard a word because she was too busy staring at Jacob, this man who had wandered into her life and changed everything. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed her with such tender passion that several women in the audience sighed audibly. The reception was held in the town square with tables of food and a fiddle player providing music. People who had mocked Clara for years came to wish her well, some genuinely, others grudgingly. She did not care. She was too happy to let old wounds matter anymore. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, Jacob pulled Clara onto the makeshift dance floor. She had never learned to dance properly, too busy with her books, but Jacob led her with patient confidence, and they swayed together under the stars. "Mrs. River," Jacob murmured against her ear. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Clara said, smiling against his shoulder. "Mr. River, what would you like to do on our first night as a married couple?" Jacob laughed softly. "Is it terrible that I want to read with you? I found a new book at the general store last week, saved my wages to buy it as a surprise. It's a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. I thought we could read them together." Clara pulled back to look at him, her eyes shining with love. "That's not terrible at all. That's perfect. That's us." They slipped away from the reception as soon as it was polite to do so. Walking hand in hand to the small house Thomas had helped them purchase at the edge of town, it was modest but cozy, with 2 rooms and a small kitchen. Jacob had spent weeks fixing it up, repairing the roof and building bookshelves along every available wall in anticipation of Clara's collection. Inside, Jacob lit the lamps and retrieved the book of sonnets from his pack. They settled together on the small sofa, Clara tucked against Jacob's side, and took turns reading the beautiful, intricate poetry. When they came to Sonnet 116, Jacob read slowly, his voice full of feeling. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." He paused and looked at Clara. "That's us, isn't it? True minds married together. No impediments, no alterations, just 2 people who understand each other." "Yes," Clara whispered, "that's exactly us." They continued reading until the words began to blur with tiredness, and then Jacob carried Clara to their bedroom, where they made love for the first time with gentle passion, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned to read together, patiently, reverently, and with deep joy. The years that followed were not without challenges, but they were filled with love. Jacob continued working for Thomas, eventually becoming a partner in the store. Clara's reputation in town slowly transformed from book girl to that clever Mrs. River, especially after she started a small lending library in their home, allowing townspeople to borrow books for a small fee. Children began coming to her for reading lessons, and she discovered she loved teaching almost as much as she loved reading. In the spring of 1880, Clara gave birth to their first child, a robust boy they named Thomas, after Clara's father. The birth was difficult, and for several terrifying hours Jacob thought he might lose her. But Clara was stronger than she looked. She recovered slowly, and Jacob was overwhelmed by the sight of his wife holding their son, reading to the infant in a soft, melodic voice, even though Thomas was too young to understand. 3 years later, a daughter arrived, Sarah, named for Jacob's mother. She had Clara's hazel eyes and Jacob's dark hair, and from the moment she could sit up, she reached for books with grasping hands. Jacob would often come home to find Clara and Sarah curled together in the rocking chair, reading fairy tales while young Thomas played at their feet. Thomas Montgomery lived long enough to see both his grandchildren grow into clever, curious children who loved stories as much as their mother. He passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1885, content in the knowledge that his daughter had found happiness beyond anything he had imagined for her. As the children grew, the little house became too small, and Jacob built an addition, including a proper library room with floor-to-ceiling shelves. Clara's collection had grown to over 200 books, many of them gifts from Jacob, who never forgot the magic of that moment when he had first learned to recognize words on a page. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised Clara with a bound journal filled with his own writing. 10 years of thoughts, observations, and love letters he had written but never shared. Clara read through it with tears streaming down her face, amazed by the beauty of his words, the depth of his feelings. "You've become a wonderful writer," she said, clutching the journal to her chest. "Jacob, these are beautiful." "I had a good teacher," Jacob said, pulling her into his arms. "Everything good in my life came from the day I walked into your father's shop and saw you reading by the window. You taught me more than letters and words, Clara. You taught me what it means to be truly alive." "You taught me too," Clara said softly. "You taught me that loving books doesn't mean isolating myself from the world. You taught me that sharing stories is even better than reading them alone. You taught me what love really means." They stood together in their library, surrounded by books and memories, and Clara felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was everything she had dreamed of during those lonely years in Sweetwater, being mocked for loving books too much. She had found someone who not only accepted her passion but shared it, who saw her love of reading as the treasure it was. By 1890, Thomas was 10 and Sarah was 7, both of them voracious readers who begged for more books at every opportunity. Jacob and Clara often took them on trips to larger towns, visiting bookshops and libraries, instilling in their children the same love of learning that had brought their parents together. One evening, as the family sat together in the library, Thomas reading aloud from Treasure Island while Sarah followed along, Jacob reached over and took Clara's hand. She looked at him, this man who had wandered into her life with an armful of unspoken dreams, and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered. "About how lucky I am," Jacob said quietly, "that I stopped drifting, that I walked into that shop on that particular day, that you offered to teach a rough cowboy his letters, that you saw something in me worth loving." "I saw everything," Clara said, squeezing his hand, "and I would do it all again in a heartbeat. You brought me more than books, Jacob. You brought me love, family, and a life I never dared to dream was possible." Young Thomas looked up from his reading. "Papa, are you and Mama being mushy again?" "Yes, we are," Jacob said, grinning at his son. "And someday when you're older, you'll understand why. Now keep reading. I want to know if Jim finds the treasure." As Thomas's young voice filled the room with tales of pirates and adventure, Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder and closed her eyes, listening to the sound of her children learning to love stories the way she did. She thought about the lonely girl she had been, mocked for loving books too much, and the woman she had become. A wife, a mother, a teacher, surrounded by the people she loved most in the world. Jacob had brought her an armful of books that first day, metaphorically speaking, but he had given her so much more. He had given her understanding, companionship, and a love that grew deeper with every passing year. Together they had built a life based on mutual respect, shared passions, and the simple joy of reading together. Outside, the Texas night was quiet except for the distant sound of cattle lowing and the soft whisper of wind through the prairie grass. Inside, the River family was warm and safe, surrounded by hundreds of stories waiting to be discovered, and a love story of their own that was still being written with every passing day. Years later, when Clara was an old woman with silver in her hair and grandchildren at her feet, she would look back on that moment when Jacob walked into her father's shop and see it for what it truly was, the beginning of everything. The moment when a lonely cowboy who could not read and a lonely woman who read too much found each other and proved that love, like a good story, has the power to transform lives. They lived out their days in Sweetwater, growing old together, still reading every evening by lamplight, still sharing stories and dreams. And when Clara finally passed away in 1920 at the age of 64, with Jacob holding her hand and their children and grandchildren gathered around, her last words were about books. "Keep reading to each other," she whispered. "Stories are how we understand the world. Stories are how we find love. Never stop sharing them." Jacob survived her by only 6 months, his heart unable to bear the loneliness of a world without her. But their legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren, all of them readers, all of them believers in the power of stories to connect souls across any divide. The little lending library Clara had started grew into a proper community library funded by the modest fortune Jacob and Clara had accumulated through years of hard work and careful saving. On the library's dedication plaque, installed by their children's request, were the words that had defined their parents' love story. "She was mocked for loving books too much. A cowboy brought her an armful and said, 'Teach me to read.' And together they built a life more beautiful than any story." In the end, that was the truth of Clara and Jacob River. Two lonely souls who found each other in a dusty Texas town, who learned that love grows best when it is rooted in understanding, respect, and shared dreams. They had faced mockery and suspicion, had weathered storms both literal and figurative, and had emerged with a love that lasted a lifetime. Their story became the stuff of local legend in Sweetwater, told and retold to new generations. The strange book-loving girl and the illiterate cowboy who learned to read for her. It was a simple story on the surface, but like all the best stories, it contained deeper truths about courage, acceptance, and the transformative power of love. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, two souls read together under eternal stars, their love story continuing forever, one beautiful word at a time.